The judge's hammer falling sounded like a nail being driven into a coffin lid, and for Lin Wei, it might as well have been. 18 years old, an orphan twice over, first by plague in her homeland and now by a fever that had taken the storekeeper she'd been sold to, she stood alone in the back of the frigid town hall of Redemption, Nevada. The wind found every crack in the clapboard walls, a constant, whining reminder of the winter that held the mountains in its teeth. Her dark green prairie dress was thin, a summer garment ill-suited for the biting cold of December 1878, and the grey wool scarf around her neck was more habit than warmth. The town council, led by the portly and prosperous Bartholomew Thorne, had decided her fate. She was a stray, a piece of property without an owner, and a burden. The consensus was to put her on the next eastbound freight wagon, sending her back toward the railroad camps where, they reasoned, she belonged. The words hung in the air, thick with a contempt she had long grown used to. She stared at the floorboards, tracing the path of a single, grimy crack, focusing on it so she wouldn't have to meet the dozen pairs of eyes that dismissed her existence. "It is settled then," Thorne announced, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He adjusted his waistcoat, a garment of rich burgundy that seemed to soak up all the warmth from the room's pot-belly stove. "The freighter leaves Thursday. We'll see. She has provisions for the journey." Provisions meant a stale loaf of bread and a water skin, if she was lucky. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered townsfolk. It was a neat, tidy solution to an untidy problem. But then a different sound cut through the room, the scrape of a chair against the floor from the far corner. Every head turned. Silas Kane rose to his feet. He was a man who moved with a deliberate quiet that made people nervous. He wasn't large, but a stillness clung to him, the kind that came from seeing too much and saying too little. A worn Colt Peacemaker rested low on his hip, its walnut grip smooth from use. No one knew much about him, only that he'd filed a homestead claim north of town 6 months ago and kept to himself. His presence in town was rare, and his presence at a town meeting was unheard of. "I have business with the judge," Silas said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, yet it carried easily across the room. Judge Abernathy, a man whose patience was as thin as his hair, peered over his spectacles. "State it, Mr. Kane." "We're concluding here." Silas's gaze swept over the room, cool and unreadable, bypassing the smug face of Thorne, the curious faces of the ranchers, and the wary faces of their wives. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, finally came to rest on Lin Wei. She flinched, expecting the same dismissal she saw in every other face. But his look held something else. It was not pity, nor was it kindness. It was assessment. "I need a wife," Silas stated, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. "To prove up my claim. The Homestead Act favors a family man." A nervous titter went through the women in the room. Several of the younger, unmarried daughters of local ranchers preened, straightening their bonnets. Silas Kane was a mystery, and therefore a fascination. He was a gunslinger, they whispered, though no one had ever seen him draw his weapon in anger. Thorne chuckled, a condescending, rumbling sound. "An ambitious plan, Kane. But I believe the eligible ladies of Redemption have certain standards." He gestured vaguely toward the rancher's daughters. Silas ignored him completely. His focus remained on the solitary figure at the back of the room. He took 2 steps forward, his boots echoing on the worn planks. "Her," he said, nodding toward Lin Wei. The room, which had been filled with whispers, fell utterly silent for a moment before erupting. It wasn't a gasp of shock. It was a wave of raw, derisive laughter. The sound was a physical blow, and Lin Wei shrank into herself, her face burning with a shame so hot it felt like a brand. Ranchers slapped their knees, their wives hid smirks behind gloved hands. Thorne laughed the loudest, his whole body shaking with mirth. The idea was preposterous, a joke in poor taste. A man like Silas Kane, a white man, choosing a Chinese orphan, a girl who was less than a servant. Judge Abernathy cleared his throat, his face flushing. "Mr. Kane, this is highly irregular. She is not a citizen. There are complications. The law says any 2 unmarried persons of legal age can be joined," Silas countered, his voice flat, cutting through the laughter and silencing it. "She is of age. I am of age. There are no other complications that concern the laws." He did not look at the judge when he spoke. He was looking only at Lin Wei. He walked the length of the room until he stood before her. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes and the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He smelled of pine smoke and cold air. He did not offer a gentle smile or a comforting word. He simply asked, his voice low so only she could hear, "I have a cabin. It's warm. There's food enough for the winter. It is not a palace, but it is safe. Will you marry me, miss?" She looked up into his face, searching for the trick, the cruelty she knew must be hiding there. But she found none. She saw only a stark, lonely landscape in his eyes, as vast and unforgiving as the territory around them. He was offering her a choice that was not a choice at all, a harsh, unknown life with him, or a certain, brutal end on the road east. She thought of the biting wind, of the laughter, of the utter emptiness ahead. Then she looked at the steady set of his jaw. She gave a single, sharp nod. Her throat was too tight for words. "She accepts," Silas announced to the stunned room. The judge, flustered but a stickler for the letter of the law, reluctantly performed the ceremony. The words were a blur to Lin. She was aware only of Silas's hand, calloused and firm, as it briefly touched hers. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, there was no cheer, only a heavy, disapproving silence. As Silas led her out of the town hall and into the biting wind, the laughter started again behind them, quieter this time, but somehow meaner. It followed them down the street, a chorus of mockery from the town that had just cast her out, only to see her claimed by a man they understood even less. She pulled the thin grey scarf tighter, but it could not protect her from the cold that came from within. What kind of man was this? And what kind of life had she just shackled herself to? The only thing she knew for sure was that the laughter of redemption would be the anthem of her new beginning. The Kane homestead was a small, solid cabin nestled in a hollow of the northern hills, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a stand of ponderosa pines. It was, as he had promised, warm and stocked for winter. Sacks of flour and beans were stacked against one wall, and salted meat hung from the rafters. It was a place of stark functionality, with a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. There was one bed, a simple frame with a straw-ticking mattress. Without a word, he gestured to it. "This is yours," he said. He took a pair of blankets and made a pallet for himself on the floor by the fire. Their first days together were a study in silence. They moved around each other in the small space like wary animals. Silas would rise before dawn, tend to his 2 horses and the milk cow in the lean-to stable, and spend the day checking his trap lines or cutting firewood. Lin took over the cabin. She swept the floor, cooked meals from their supplies, and mended the few clothes he owned. She was a meticulous worker, her hands quick and deft. She found a rhythm in the chores, a way to fill the long, quiet hours. He never touched her. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was practical. "The snow will be deep by morning, or we need to haul more water yet," she felt his eyes on her sometimes. When she was kneading bread, her sleeves rolled up, or when she was staring into the fire, lost in thought. It wasn't a threatening gaze, but an observant one, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle. 2 weeks after their strange wedding, the sky turned a bruised, leaden grey and the real winter arrived. A blizzard descended from the high peaks, a howling white monster that erased the world. For 3 days, the wind shrieked and snow piled in drifts that buried the cabin windows. They were sealed in their small wooden box, the fire their only companion. The silence between them deepened, stretched thin by the storm's fury. On the 4th day, the wind died, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. The snow was piled 10 feet deep in the hollows. Later that afternoon, a figure on snowshoes appeared, struggling toward their cabin. It was Jed, the son of their nearest neighbors, the Graysons, whose small ranch was 2 miles deeper into the hills. The boy was half frozen, his face raw from the wind. He stumbled inside, gasping out his story. The weight of the snow had collapsed the roof of their barn. Their livestock, Their entire livelihood was trapped inside. His father had gone in to try and save them, and a falling beam had broken his leg. They were isolated, helpless. Jed had spent 6 hours traveling the 2 miles to reach them. Silas gave the boy a piece of jerky and a mug of hot water. He listened to the story without expression, but Lynn saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. She looked out the small, cleared patch of window at the immense, hostile landscape. A trip to the Grayson place would be treacherous, if not impossible. She expected Silas to say what anyone else would, that it was too dangerous, that nothing could be done. Instead, he stood up and began pulling on his heavy winter coat and boots. He said nothing to her, but she knew. He was going. While he went to the stable to ready his sturdiest horse, Lynn moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She tore strips from a clean bedsheet for bandages. She found a small wooden box and filled it with salve for burns and dried herbs she recognized from her mother's remedies. She ladled hot broth into a seal jar and wrapped it in cloth to keep it warm. She packed it all into a leather satchel. When Silas came back inside, his face grim, he stopped and looked at what she was doing. He saw the satchel, the neatly prepared supplies. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond mere assessment. It was surprise, and perhaps a sliver of respect. "The horse can't carry 2 in this," he said. "I will walk in your tracks," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. She was already wrapping her own worn boots with strips of burlap for better traction. He hesitated for only a second, then gave a single, sharp nod. The journey was a slow, brutal fight against the elements. The cold was a physical pain, and the snow was a relentless enemy, sucking at their legs with every step. Silas broke the trail, his powerful frame pushing through the drifts, while Lynn followed carefully in the deep groove he left behind. He moved with an incredible stamina, reading the contours of the hidden land, avoiding the deepest drifts. He never looked back, but she knew he was setting a pace she could just barely manage, aware of her presence behind him. They reached the Grayson ranch as dusk was painting the snow in shades of purple and gray. The scene was one of devastation. The barn had caved in on itself, a tangle of splintered beams and heavy, snow-laden roofing. A low, mournful sound came from within, the cries of trapped and injured animals. Martha Grayson rushed out to meet them, her face a mask of despair. "Silas, thank God. My William, his leg. I don't know what to do." Inside their small cabin, William Grayson was pale with pain, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. While Silas and Jed immediately went to the ruined barn to assess the damage, Lynn knelt beside the injured man. She gently cut away the pant leg. The break was clean, but the bone was out of place. "Hold him steady," she told a weeping Martha. With a calm that surprised even herself, Lynn took 2 flat pieces of wood from the kindling box. Working with a gentle but firm pressure she'd watched her father use countless times, she manipulated the bone back into alignment. William cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and then a sigh of relief as the intense pressure subsided. Lynn bound the leg tightly between the splints with the bandages she'd brought. She gave him a diluted tincture of an herb for pain and instructed Martha on how to keep him warm. She then went out to the barn. The air was thick with the smell of hay, cold, and fear. Silas had already managed to clear an opening and was working with a quiet, focused intensity, leveraging beams and cutting away debris to free the animals. He moved with the deadly grace of a predator, but all his energy was bent towards saving, not harming. Lynn went to the animals that were already freed, checking them for injuries. She found a young calf shivering violently, its breathing shallow. She mixed a warm mash of bran and water from the Grayson stove, adding a pinch of another herb from her satchel. She coaxed the weak animal to drink. For hours they worked under the cold light of a rising moon, a silent, efficient team. Silas provided the strength, Lynn the healing. By midnight, all the living animals were freed and moved into a makeshift shelter against the cabin wall. They had saved all but 2. As they prepared for the long walk home, Martha Grayson pressed a small object into Lynn's hand. It was a little bird, carved from a piece of pale wood, worn smooth with time. "My father made this," she whispered, her eyes full of tears. "For luck." We owe you everything. Both of you. Lynn closed her fingers around the small, smooth bird. As she did, her gaze fell upon one of the rescued cows, huddled miserably against the cabin. On its flank was a brand, a complex design of a snake coiled around a mountain peak. A jolt went through her, cold and sharp as an icicle. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen that brand before. It was seared not just on the hide of cattle, but into her memory. It was the mark of the syndicate that had bought her from a starving village and shipped her across the ocean in a stinking, crowded ship. It was the brand of her first master, a man whose cruelty was a legend among the trafficked girls. And it was here, in this remote corner of Nevada, on a cow belonging to a simple homesteader. Back in their own cabin, the fire crackled, a warm and welcome sound after the frozen silence of the mountains. The exhaustion from their ordeal settled deep in their bones, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer a silence of strangeness, but one of shared labor and a new, unspoken understanding. Silas was cleaning a piece of horse tack, his large hand surprisingly gentle with the leather. He finally broke the quiet, his voice low. "Where did you learn to do that?" "With Grayson's leg." Lynn was sitting at the table, the small wooden bird in her palm. She traced its smooth lines with her thumb. "My father was a village healer," she said, her voice soft. "I watched him. I learned." She decided to tell him a piece of her story, a piece of the truth. "In my home, we were poor, but we had honor. Then the famine came. Men came to our village. They promised food, a new life in America for the young ones. A life of opportunity." She spat the word like something foul. "My parents believed them. They were promised I would be a seamstress for a wealthy family. Instead, I was sold. First to a man in San Francisco. Then to the storekeeper here." She looked up at him, and he had stopped his work. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. She did not tell him about the brand. The fear was still too fresh, a cold knot in her stomach. He was quiet for a long time, then he rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner. He opened it and took out a small, dog-eared daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. He set it on the table in front of her. It was a picture of a young woman with a gentle smile, holding the hand of a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5. "My sister, Sarah," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he tried to conceal. "And my nephew, Luke." He paused. Their homestead was just over that ridge. Best grazing land in this valley. Her husband died in a mining accident. A year later, Sarah took a fever. She was dead in a week. "I'm sorry," Lynn whispered. Thorne was her husband's employer, Silas continued, his voice hardening. "The mine, the freight company that supplies it, he owns it all." After Sarah's husband died, Thorne came with papers. Said the land was collateral for company debt. He took everything. The cabin, the cattle, the land. Sarah died in a rented room in town that winter. And Luke, the boy, just vanished. Thorne claimed he sent him to an orphanage in Carson City. I checked. There's no record. He's gone. He reached back into the chest and pulled out a folded, yellow document. A land deed. This is the deed Thorne used. My sister's signature, it's not right. The loop on the S is too perfect. Sarah always made her S like a lightning bolt. It's a forgery. I came here to prove it. I filed the homestead claim to have a reason to stay, to watch him. The gun, he said, nodding toward the Colt, is not for show. It's for him. When the time is right. The revelation settled over Lynn. This quiet man was not just a drifter. He was a man on a mission, fueled by a grief and a rage he kept banked like the coals in their hearth. He was playing a long, dangerous game. A few days later, they had an unexpected visitor. Bartholomew Thorne, flanked by 2 of his hired men, rode up to their cabin. The winter sun glinted off the silver on his saddle. He dismounted, all smiles and false bonhomie. Cain. "I heard about your heroics at the Grayson place," he boomed, striding toward the cabin as if he owned it. A commendable act of neighborly charity. Commendable indeed. His eye swept over the tidy homestead, then landed on Lynn as she stood in the doorway, a silent shadow. His smile tightened, a flicker of his true feelings showing through. "Just helping a neighbor," Silas said, his voice flat. He stood on the porch, his body relaxed but positioned between Thorne and the cabin door, a subtle, protective stance. "Of course," Thorne said smoothly. "Though I fear their troubles are far from over. Poor William is deeply in my debt at the general store. I may have to acquire his land to settle his accounts. A shame, but business is business." It was a clear, unmistakable threat. He was telling Silas that his heroism had been for nothing. As Thorne spoke, Lynn's eyes were drawn to the horses. One of his hired men rode a sturdy-looking bay. And there, on its flank, was the brand. The Snake and the Mountain. The same brand as the Grayson's cow. The same brand from her past. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Thorne wasn't just grabbing land. The Graysons hadn't bought that cow at a market. Thorne must have sold it to them, or they had acquired it from his stock. He was involved with the syndicate. He was trafficking not just land and goods, but people. And livestock to cover his tracks. Silas's lost nephew, had he been sent to an orphanage, or had he been sold, just like she had? A wave of icy fear washed over her. To speak would be to invite a wrath she knew all too well. To stay silent was to let this man continue, to let what happened to her and to Silas's family happen to others. She looked at Silas, at the quiet determination in his face, at the worn photograph she knew he kept in the chest. She thought of Martha Grayson's tears and the small wooden bird in her pocket. She took a breath and stepped out from behind Silas. Her voice was small in the vast, cold air, but it was clear and steady. "Mr. Thorne," she said. He turned, surprised she would dare to address him. "Yes?" "That brand," she said, pointing a trembling finger at the horse. "The Snake and the Mountain. I have seen it before. A long way from here." Thorne's practiced smile vanished. His face became a cold, hard mask. The air crackled with sudden, violent tension. His eyes, small and dark, bored into her. "You must be mistaken, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing purr. "I am not mistaken," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thorne stared at her for a long moment, then a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He looked at Silas. "You should teach your property some manners, Cain. It's a dangerous world for those who speak out of turn." He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, his men following close behind. The threat was no longer veiled. It was now a promise. 3 years passed. The winter of 1881 arrived not with a punishing blizzard, but with a gentle, blanketing snow. The Cain homestead was transformed. The small cabin now stood as the heart of a proper ranch house, with 2 new wings built from sturdy pine. A large, well-constructed barn stood opposite, and the corrals were filled with a herd of hardy cattle, known throughout the territory for their resilience. The laughter of redemption had long since faded, replaced by whispers of grudging respect. Lynn was no longer the silent girl in the thin green dress. She was the mistress of the Cain ranch. She managed the accounts, her mind sharp and her dealings fair. She had established a trade network with the Chinese crews working on the new railroad spur, bypassing Thorne's monopolistic general store and bringing a new prosperity to the small homesteaders in the hills. Her herb garden behind the house was famous, and people would ride for miles for one of her remedies. They called her the healer of the hills. Silas had not drawn his gun in a fight in 3 years. His hands, once calloused by the grip of a pistol, were now weathered from handling reins, hammers, and saws. His reputation was no longer that of a mysterious gunslinger, but of a master rancher, a man who had built a thriving life from nothing but rock and grit. The silence between him and Lynn had blossomed into a comfortable quiet, punctuated by easy conversation and shared glances that spoke more than words ever could. Their stand against Bartholomew Thorne had been a quiet war, not a loud one. Using Lynn's knowledge of the brand, Silas had sent a carefully worded telegraph to a retired U.S. Marshal he had once known. The investigation was slow and painstaking. They gathered evidence piece by piece, testimony from a Chinese railroad foreman Lynn trusted, discrepancies in land deeds they found by searching county records, and proof of cattle sales that didn't add up. The end for Thorne came not with a gunfight in the street, but with the quiet arrival of 2 federal marshals holding warrants for land fraud, smuggling, and human trafficking. His empire, built on debt and fear, collapsed like a house of cards. The people he had indebted turned on him, their fear replaced by anger. Among his meticulously kept ledgers, they found the truth about Silas's nephew. Luke had not been sent to an orphanage. He had been sold to a brutal silver mining camp in Utah. The marshals found him there, a boy of 10 now, thin and hardened, but alive. He was home now, living with them at the ranch, slowly learning to trust again. That evening, the town of Redemption was holding its annual winter festival in the very same hall where Lynn had once been condemned. The air was filled with the sound of a fiddler and warm, cheerful chatter. When Silas and Lynn entered, a hush fell over the room. But it was not the silence of scorn. It was one of awe. The Graysons, their ranch now prosperous, rushed to greet them. Others followed, men who had once laughed now tipped their hats, asking Silas's advice on wintering their herds. Women who had once smirked now approached Lynn, asking for a poultice for a child's cough. They didn't bow down, but their deference was a currency more valuable than gold. Lynn wore a new dress of deep green wool, warm and well-made, a gift from Silas. But around her neck, she still wore the old, faded grey scarf from that first day. It was a reminder of where she had come from. Silas came to stand beside her, his presence a solid warmth at her back. He wasn't looking at the crowd that now revered them. He was looking only at her. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together naturally. "Are you warm enough?" he asked, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his coat familiar and comforting. She looked around the room, at the lights, the faces, the life they had built together against all odds. "I am now," she said. "Home was not a place you were given. It was a shelter you built with your own 2 hands, board by board, against the long and bitter cold. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.